We're going to continue simplifying complex numbers. We already talked about adding, subtracting, and multiplying. Now we're going to look at dividing. With a complex number, when we divide, we can't have an imaginary number in the denominator. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of it. Now there's two different types of division that we're going to be looking at. One is with a monomial, and the other one was with a binomial. Now with a monomial, all we're going to do is multiply the top and the bottom by I. So when we multiply the top and the bottom by I, we're going to distribute the I. So that gives us 1I plus 5I squared. Then we're going to multiply the bottom by I, and that gives us I squared. Now remember that I squared is -1. So this becomes -5. This becomes -1. So I'm going to write it in standard form. And remember, standard form is a plus bi. Real number comes first, imaginary number comes second. So I'm going to put -5 plus I divided by -1. I'm going to divide each of these by -1, so I get 5 minus I. And that right there is my answer. So for letter B, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by I. I distribute the I to each of the terms. I get 3I minus 4I squared over 2I squared. Now, once again, I squared is -1. Since that's a -4, it's going to be a +4. I squared is -1, so that gives us a -2. So I have 4 plus 3I over -2. I'm going to divide each of them by -2. So I get -2 minus 3 over 2I. And that gives me my answer. So looking at letter C, I do the same thing. I'm going to multiply by I. And that gives me 8I plus 10I squared over 3I squared. I squared is -1. So that gives me a -10. This gives me -3. I'm going to put the real number first. So I have -10 plus 8I divided by -3. I'm going to divide each of these by -3. So I get 10 over 3 minus 8 over 3I. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at dividing by a binomial. Dividing by a binomial is a little bit more complicated. We're going to multiply it by its conjugate. And it's going to be the conjugate of the denominator. Conjugate is a fancy way of saying write the same thing down, but change the sign in the middle. So since this is 5 minus I, I'm going to change it to 5 plus I. But whatever I multiply by the bottom with, I'm going to do the same thing to the top. Because I'm multiplying binomials, I have to FOIL this. So 2 times 5 gives me 10. 2 times I gives me 2I. -I times 5 is -5I. -I times I is -I squared. On the bottom, 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times I is 5I. -I times 5 is -5I. And -I times I is -I squared. Now, when we're looking at this, two things we should notice. One is that, of course, the I squareds are -1, so that becomes a +1. This also becomes a +1. The second thing is, notice that the i's cancel in the denominator. And that's why we do it. Because when you multiply by the conjugate, the middle terms always cancel. And so now we're left with a real number in the denominator. So we have 26 in our denominator. We're going to add the numerator. We have 10 plus 1, which is 11, and 2i minus 5i, which is -3i. I'm going to write it in standard form, 11 over 26 minus 3 over 26i. Now, looking at letter E, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to multiply it by the conjugate based off of the denominator. So since the denominator is 2 plus I, I'm going to multiply it by 2 minus I. I'm going to FOIL the top. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times I is negative 5I. 9I times 2 is 18I. And 9I times negative I is negative 9I squared. In the denominator, 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times I is negative 2I. I times 2 is 2I. And I times negative I is negative I squared. Once again, two things you should notice. The I squareds are negative 1, so that becomes a positive 9. This becomes a positive 1. And the middle terms cancel, so we have a real number in the denominator. No more imaginary number. We add the like terms. That gives us 19. And when we add the i's, what we get is 13i. So I'm going to write it in standard form, 19 over 5 plus 13 over 5i. So looking at letter F, once again, we're looking at our denominator. Based off of our denominator, we're going to write the conjugate on both the top and the bottom. We're going to FOIL it because we have binomials. So 1 times 4 is 4. 1 times 3i is 3i. 11i times 4 is 44i. 11i times 3i is 33i squared. On the bottom, 4 times 4 is 16. That gives us positive 12i. When we multiply, we get negative 12i. And our last one, negative 3i times 3i is negative 9i squared. Once again, I squared is negative 1, so this is negative 33. This is positive 9. So when we're looking at our numerator, we have 4 plus a negative 33, which gives us negative 29, plus 47i, and we divide that. Middle numbers cancel. 16 plus 9 is 25. So we have negative 29 over 25 plus 47 over 25i. Now, looking at our last three, we've got a combination of both a monomial and a binomial. Remember, with the monomial, we multiply it by just the I, and that gives us 1i minus 2i squared over 4i squared. I squared is negative 1. So I'm going to write the real number first, 2 plus I over negative 4. So I get negative 1/2 minus 1/4 I, and that would be the standard form. Remember, when we have a binomial in the denominator, we multiply it by its conjugate. Six times 4 is 24. 6 times 5i is 30i. I times 4 is 4i. And I times 5i is 5i squared. When we multiply the denominator, 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 5i is 20i. Negative 5i times 4 is negative 20i. And negative 5i times 5i is negative 25i squared. We have to remember that I squared is negative 1, so negative 5 and 25. Middle terms cancel. Our denominator is 41. Our numerator gives us 19 and 34i. We're going to write it in standard form, 19 over 41 plus 34 over 41i. Our last one, we're going to look at our denominator. We're going to figure out that our conjugate is 9 minus 4i. We multiply that on the top and the bottom. So the top is 18 and negative 8i, negative 27i, and we have positive 12i squared. In the denominator, 9 times 9 is 81. 9 times negative 4i is negative 36i, positive 36i, and negative 16i squared. Remember that I squared is negative 1, so negative 12, positive 16. 18 minus 12 gives us 6. Negative 8i minus 27 gives us negative 35i. Middle terms cancel. 81 plus 16 gives us 97. So we have 6 over 97 minus 35 over 97.